Case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad, EDL 851, Supervision and Evaluation. So what do we know about this case study as a summary? It's a small rural school, one of 3 elementary schools within the district, with a relatively small staff of approximately 25 staff members. It's a high-performing school. Students have good attendance. They score above average on testing scores, and there's a high parent satisfaction. In year number 3, Mrs. Wilson, who's the administrator in her 3rd year, has picked up on some stress of one of the first grade teachers, who is Mrs. Horton. At the beginning of year number 4 for Mrs. Wilson, a new math program is being implemented throughout the school. So Crestview Elementary is a really good school that obviously has performed well. Mrs. Horton has had a changed attitude after several years of being a really great teacher. Parents are now coming up with complaints about Mrs. Horton and the way she treats her students in her 1st grade classroom. And parents have contacted not only the administrator, but also the superintendent and Board of Education members with complaints. And parents are now demanding that their student are removed from Mrs. Horton's classroom, and in particular one whose name is Mr. Stafford. So problem identification and analysis. So Mrs. Horton has become increasingly stressed, and Mrs. Wilson, the administrator, knows that there are possibly some problems at home with a divorce and being a newly single mom of some teenagers. Mrs. Horton has been late to school and refuses to hold parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Horton was absent from school during the entire summer break, which was definitely changed behavior from past summers. Mrs. Horton did not support the new math curriculum. Mrs. Wilson did have a private conversation with Mrs. Horton in regards to the curriculum, and not much had changed because of that. Parents are now starting to call and write letters about Mrs. Horton's behavior in the classroom. Board of Education members have received phone calls, and Mrs. Horton was called into a meeting with an upset parent. Furthermore, Mr. Stafford, the upset parent, is demanding that his child be removed from Mrs. Horton's classroom. So Mrs. Wilson called a meeting with the 3 of them, Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Horton, and Mr. Stafford, about what had been happening with Mr. Stafford's daughter, Julie, in that 1st grade classroom. So I think at this point, it's important to kind of talk a little bit about the meeting and some of the things that could have happened differently. The meeting did not go well and did not end productively. Mrs. Horton did get upset. So I think it's important to talk about what kind of got them to the point of the meeting, and could anything have been done differently? And we'll touch on that in just a second. So I think also in analyzing this problem, what help and support does Mrs. Horton need? The meeting did not go well, and it ended with everyone leaving quickly, as Mr. Stafford kind of made some accusations toward Mrs. Horton, and she kind of blew up. So prior to the conference, probably what should have happened is, I think that Mrs. Horton probably needed some more support and information about what Mr. Stafford specifically was upset about. During the conference, they were in Mrs. Horton's 1st grade classroom. The chairs were very small. It was not a comfortable setting for anyone. They probably should have moved more maybe to a confidential conference room within the school, and Mrs. Horton probably should have had more of her information gathered. I think after the conference, instead of the way it happened, there probably should have been a debriefing, and there should have been some solution steps provided on what was going to happen, not only for Julie, but for Mrs. Horton as well. So what's gotten us to this point? Obviously, what could have been done prior? So maybe changing some of the steps prior to the conference would have prevented some of these things. So this brings us to, what are the vision and goals that could have been brought forth to help Mrs. Horton before she started struggling? So what are some of the things that could have been put in place in maybe the administrator being proactive when she first saw she was stressing at the end of the year? Even just a small conversation of, hey, I really noticed your stress level has gone up. What can I do to help? I think sometimes it's hard to always know when people have personal things going on, the best way to handle that, but maybe just a small little conversation kind of I always had a professor say, flash your headlights and let them know you've noticed that they're struggling. A proposed plan of action. So what should happen from here? I think one of the things that should have happened is that the principal should have met with Mrs. Horton to be proactive, asked her what was going on when she first saw the stress, discussed the lack of collaboration with the math curriculum, the concerns of being late to school and the refusal to hold parent-teacher conferences, and the parental concerns that had been coming in, I think needed to be shared up front as well. I think the principal also needed to be the leader of the meeting, kind of putting Mrs. Horton on the spot was not probably healthy. I think that maybe Mrs. Wilson should have started with calm emotion to let each party kind of be able to say their side. I think the next thing is an evaluation or plan of improvement needed for Mrs. Horton throughout the year. What is she lacking for the students in her classroom, not only on the academic, but the social emotional levels as well? And I would go about this in more of a support role. We all know that throughout our lives, things change. And so what do we need to do to help support her? This brings up the next standard, the school teaching and learning. So what really needs to be happening with Mrs. Horton so that teaching and learning can be happening on the academic and social emotional realms in her classroom? So for a resolution, I think that the principal needs to work with Mrs. Horton on assigned tasks to help her improve instruction. I think some of the non-negotiables would be the math curriculum. She needs to be doing it. It needs to be happening in her classroom. Could she assign a teaching partner to really help them plan together? I think that it needs to be that Mrs. Horton is holding parent-teacher conferences. What kind of support does she need? It sounds as though it's happened in the past. Why is it not happening now? What support does she need to make that happen? The academic and social emotional well-being of students, can the counselor come in and assist with that within the classroom? That's an available resource that I think would be a great way to make sure that some of that social emotional was happening with students. She needs to arrive to school on time, and maybe just a quick conversation. Hey, I've noticed you've been late. What can we do to make that an easier, transition for you? Does she maybe need a break throughout the day? Could a building assistant go in and give her a break? And then I do think that the open and honest communication is a very important piece. When you know someone is struggling, you've got to be able to communicate with them. So does this look like a weekly meeting, possibly once a week after school, or a morning check-in to make sure she's there on time? I think there's a lot of ways that could look. Does Mrs. Horton need to look at a career change? Is she experiencing burnout? And I think that sometimes we're really hesitant to say that to not only our colleagues, but to people that we oversee. But life changes. We change throughout life. And I don't think that sometimes that's a bad thing. And maybe another one of those things that when you say that to someone, they really can do some self-reflection to really see some of the ways maybe they're struggling. And always to keep in mind what's best for the school and the students within the school, most importantly. I think the principal needs to make sure and communicate back with the parent, Mr. Stafford. She needs to do everything she can to keep the student in the classroom. I don't think that removing the student, sometimes that can create the waterfall effect where then you want to move the next one and the next one and the next one. I think it really needs to be helping support Mrs. Horton so that she can be the best teacher that she knows she can be. And then have that open communication with parents. And parents a lot of times just want to be heard. We need to make sure that we're doing that with parents. I think the principal also needs to follow up with the superintendent and the Board of Education concerns. Once I think concerns go outside of the building, I think it's the administrator's responsibility to make sure they're letting others know what you're doing to resolve those issues. Does the principal need to consult with other professionals, other administrators, the superintendent for ideas or assistance in this situation, and make sure that she's asking questions as needed? I think this comes back to the managing organizational systems, not only the systems within the school, but also the systems that go beyond to the board office and to the Board of Education. So debriefing this, thinking about how did I think about this? I think my main thing would be, how did I handle the entire situation? And I would look at that on everything that I value. Did I handle the teacher needs? Did I handle the parent concerns? Are the students in the classroom okay? How are my staff responding to this issue? So I think that I guess I kind of broke that down on how you value and look at your whole school over under one umbrella. And did each of those parties, did I take care of and respond to them and do what they needed and give them what they needed? When I look at instructional and academic success, were the standards for all students held in place through all the decisions that were made for everything that was done for the teacher and for the students? Did I ethically do that? And then did I make sure that I held integrity in place for all parties involved, from the teacher to the staff? So this brings up the professional ethics and integrity. Obviously, you would want to make sure that you are following all ethics when dealing with all areas in this case. So as a reflection, I would say always be proactive dealing with people. When you see at first that maybe someone is struggling, be willing to step up and talk to them about it, ask them about it. Sometimes when we're struggling in our personal lives, that's a hard thing to let others in on. But I think that the sooner you do that, the sooner people know that they have support. Be willing to approach things in a helping to learn and improve way. I think that's the fairest way to do it at the beginning. I think once you try that and maybe problems persist and continue, then I think you can go to the next step. I think another thing that you have to remember is a career lasts the majority of someone's life. So people change, life changes, situations happen that we could never imagine, and that changes people's outlooks and view. And I think that, especially in a teaching career, we have to remember that. I think always be understanding and operate with compassion, have open communication, know where you stand with what is a non-negotiable. You must teach the math curriculum. That is not something I'm going to budge on. So know where you stand with that once you're a leader. And then obviously the academic and social emotional needs of all students within the school are extremely critical. So continuing on with the reflection, I think that the reflection kind of goes with the overall educational systems activity. You really have to look at, as a leader, how are you applying everything over your entire school? And I think that kind of comes up nicely with the end and the reflection. And so lastly, best leaders have high consideration factor. They really care about their people. And I think as I reflect on this case, I think that was one of my biggest things, is that I think you have to go about caring about your people and the people within the processes. And so that can't always be changed, but I think that's where you have to start, is you have to really care about the people and be willing to help and support them. I think that no matter what, in a situation like this, you would be thinking, how did I handle this situation, and what did I do wrong, or what could I do different? Valuing responses, were the teacher's needs met? Were the parent concerns met? How are the students in the classroom, and how is the staff responding to this? Is the staff even aware that all of this has gone on, if it's been a confidential issue with just one teacher? I think you also then need to look at the academic and instructional success, and where instructional and academic standards for all the students held in place within the situation. Were ethics upheld? Was integrity held in place for all parties involved? The student, the teacher, the parent, the administrator, as well as the board office staff as well. So I think when you really look at all of this, there are a lot of things tied in. And when you have things that aren't going well within a classroom setting, you still have to maintain the academic and the social emotional health and strategies of that classroom. I think that's a non-negotiable thing that has to happen. So that brings up the professional ethics and integrity. Was everything held in place for all parties involved? So reflection. I think that several of the things that I think when I think of this case and how I process through this case is to always be proactive with dealing with people. Could things be